Debate. The honourable member for St. Paul's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The need to base public policy on reliable evidence and for the public to have access to, as well as understand, that evidence is an issue that I have advocated for passionately my entire political career. I'm proud to speak today in support of a Liberal motion before the House. The thrust of the motion is simple. Scientists should be able to discuss their research findings publicly in a timely manner and without political interference. Unfortunately, that is not the current reality for scientists working for, or sometimes even with, the Federal Public Service in Canada. As the motion states, quote, the government has constrained the ability of federal scientists to share their research and to collaborate with their peers, and federal scientists have been muzzled and prevented from speaking to the media about their work. François Giraud
was responsible for the communication of information program at Moncton University, explained the dangers of this approach when he spoke to the media today. The dangers of such a practice and the efforts to control a message has been negative. The health of our democratic health relies a great deal on the transparency of our governments. Taxpayers pay for the very existence of their government. So this free access to government information goes through transparency and freedom of the press, but as well in the case of an organization that is subsidized, that is a scientific organization, through freedom of speech.
Findings of a 2013 Professional Institute of Public Service of Canada survey, hundreds of federal scientists have been asked to alter or exclude technical information from documents, and hundreds more have been prevented from responding to inquiries from media and or the public. The Conservative government has demonstrated a clear pattern of cutting off the flow of information when it doesn't support their rigidly ideological agenda. In fact, within months of coming to power, the Conservative government introduced new, strict procedures to constrain how government scientists are allowed to speak about their research to the media. Unmuzzling la science.
To muzzle scientists doesn't mean that scientists can be free to speak without any restrictions. We know that their work often deals with sensitive issues in terms of security or are protected by intellectual property rights.
By their ministers' offices regarding how or even if they can discuss their work with the public. The tragic consequence of this government's disturbing pattern of constraining federal scientists' ability to share their research and to collaborate with their peers is that Canada's global leadership role in basic research, environmental, health and other public science is being put in jeopardy. This is not just the opinion of the Liberal Party, but of hundreds of scientists and engineers from around the world who signed an open letter last fall urging the Prime Minister to end burdensome restrictions on scientific communication and collaboration faced by the Canadian government scientists, end quote. The Liberal Party understands that researchers are central to how policy is made, and that is why the Liberals are standing firmly behind scientists and their research.
Decision makers and Canadians in general count on the critical research done by federal government scientists to ensure the safety of their food, their water, their air, and their environment.
Their findings will benefit the integrity of scientific research, will help the Canadian public and policymakers make informed decisions, and will help repair our nation's international reputation. I remember being so angered and embarrassed at a large public health conference in 2010, Women Deliver in Washington, at what this government had done to our international reputation. At the conference, Susan Cohen, head of the government affairs at the Guttmacher Institute, which is a U.S. nonprofit organization that promotes reproductive health, referred to Canada as a, quote, evidence-free zone, end quote. In the wake of the SARS crisis, the Naylor report made it clear that Canada needed a public health agency headed by a chief public health officer who could speak directly to Canadians. Buried in last year's omnibus bill is the demotion and muzzling of the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada. He has been stripped of his abilities to set priorities, determine appropriate resources, and to speak directly to Canadians without political interference. He has been reduced to an advisor to the minister on the things that the minister chooses to be advised upon, instead of actually speaking up for the public health of all Canadians whenever he or she sees fit. The Conservative government's obsession with political control and suppression of science is damaging our reputation around the world and is truly appalling. This decision and those like it must be reversed in the interests of all Canadians. One need look no farther than the government's misguided decision to replace the long-form census with the National Household Survey for proof of their ongoing war on evidence. The government spent $22 million more on the 2011 National Household Survey than it would have on the long-form census to collect data that was seriously compromised. As a result, they have essentially ended our ability to compare the data with earlier census statistics, and we can no longer see trends over time. This means we are flying blind when it comes to a whole host of policy decisions. Chief Statistician Munir Sheikh resigned from his post over this misguided decision and explained that a critical issue was the fact that StatsCan was subject to significant interference from the Conservative government. He has gone on to say that, quote, in my mind, the most serious consequence of cancelling the census is the loss of trust in Statistics Canada to be independent of government interference, end quote. Their misguided approach to the long-form census is unfortunately not the exception, but the rule in terms of this government's ongoing approach to science and scientists. Ongoing Conservative cuts to scientific research programs and its continuing muzzling of federal scientists represent clear attacks on evidence-based policymaking in an attempt to silence opposition to their ideologically based policies. I remember very early on in this regime that the government side continued to refer to the sort of liberally funded social science research as though it was a swear word, because we know that when you do good social science research, it never proves what this government is intending to do, and therefore it had to be silenced and defunded. This Conservative government understands that if problems are not measured, they are not noticed, and therefore the government does not have to fix them. The government is cynically and systematically undermining the public and the not-for-profit sector's ability to research areas they feel will prompt action on issues counter to their very narrow agenda. Unfortunately, my allotted time does not permit me to provide an exhaustive review of all the government actions in support of this disturbing pattern, but here are a few of the highlights. The world-renowned experimental lakes area was defunded by the federal government in Budget 2012. Since 2013, DFO scientists must now get departmental approval to submit research to scientific journals. And in 2013, the government shut down the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, formerly an arm's-length organization, and even prevented it from posting a final report. In 2014, the government defunded the Canadian Health Council. Also in 2014, the government closed 7 out of 9 Department of Fishery and Oceans libraries. The library closures are nothing less than an erosion of Canada's collective memory. As my Liberal colleague, the MP from Kingston, the Islands, himself a scientist, so eloquently said of the library closures, quote, the Harper government may not like science, but it does not have the right to literally trash the products of decades' worth of research just because it doesn't suit the ideology of the Harper Conservatives. Destroying data is not just an ideology.
for, I think, the third time this morning, I remind honourable members they cannot use the names of other members, including the Prime Minister, even when they are doing so in a quote. The honourable member for St. Paul's.
Destroying data is not just an ideological problem, it's also blatant fiscal mismanagement. Government decisions must be based on evidence and facts, and the health of our democracy depends on an informed public. Unfortunately, this is a government engaged in an ongoing and deliberate attack on science. They cynically and systematically gut funding for programs that may produce results not in line with conservative ideology. But this motion is more than a condemnation of the government's war on science and scientists. It sets out a roadmap for how to move us beyond an attitude towards science resembling the medieval Inquisition to modern acceptance that scientific freedom is at the root of progress. As Nobel Prize winning scientist Sidney Brenner said, quote, "Science is the best tool available for man to solve human problems," end quote. The motion calls on the government to immediately rescind all rules and regulations that muzzle government scientists, consolidate government-funded or created science so that it is easily available to the public at large, and allow scientists to be able to speak freely on their work with limited and publicly stated exceptions. The motion also comes on the government to create a chief science officer whose mandate would include ensuring that government science is freely available to those who are paying for it, namely the public. This motion offers me the opportunity to reflect on the way forward and what a government committed to evidence-based policy and the importance of research and science could achieve. We must return to the practice of transparent and public advice to ministers. We have an ideal model in the way it could and should work in Canada with the operation of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife Canada, CSIWC. CSIWC was created in 1977 as a result of a decision made at the Conference of Federal Provincial Territorial Wildlife Directors held in 1976. In 2003, the Species at Risk Act established CSIWC as an advisory body to ensure that wildlife species would be assessed using the best available scientific and Aboriginal traditional knowledge. Under SARA, the Government of Canada is mandated to take CSIWC's designations into consideration when establishing the legal list of wildlife species at risk. More importantly, CSIWC's evaluation process is independent and transparent, and the results are reported to CESCC and the public. The final decision rests indeed in the hands of the minister, but the scientific and recommendations are available to the public, and it is up therefore to the minister to explain to the public the reasons behind any decision not to follow exactly upon the recommendations of those scientists. There is no question that government decisions must be based on the full picture: science, economics, and common sense. But all the information and context that go into that decision should be available to the public in a transparent way. The Science Advisory Board of Health Canada should be re-established, not only to advise the minister on emerging issues of the day, but should be mandated to strike the appropriate advisory panels. These panels must be free of bias, conflict, and their advice seen as truly independent. They must be able to provide the best possible evidence-based policy that Canadians will be able to trust. Mr. Speaker, there is a very important virtuous cycle in between research policy and practice. It's imperative that governments understand that moving from research to policy requires really informed knowledge translation that includes the public. To move from policy to practice means that governments have to have the political will to move the good evidence-based policy into practice in a timely fashion. And then it's very important that an evidence-based government would take that practice, moving it back into better research questions by funding the applied research in community, in practice, that would allow us to ask better research questions, moving to better policy, moving to better practice. This virtuous cycle only moves properly when citizens are involved of the research and the evidence that exists. It is only then that citizens can hold their government to account. It's only then that citizens can ask why this research is not in public policy, why this policy is not actually in practice, and whether or not that practice is being properly evaluated to make sure that governments are funding what works and able to stop funding what doesn't work in this virtuous cycle. With a truly informed public, that virtuous cycle moves rapidly, and that's what we're calling on today. We want the government to understand that by muzzling scientists and not allowing researchers to speak to the public directly and to their colleagues out of government and around the world, that we are depriving Canadians of the ability to truly hold their government to account, depriving parliamentarians of the ability to hold Parliament to account, to actually insist on policy that is evidence-based, not rooted and anchored in ideology. Mr. Speaker, Canadians deserve complete and open access to the information produced by scientists, which are paid by them, the public Canadians. So I urge all members to support this motion, and I thank my colleagues for having put this forward.